NATO-EU cooperation has always been important, but the war in Ukraine has made it even more important. Because this is the most brutal war we have seen, the biggest war we have seen in Europe since the Second World War, and that makes it even more important that we stand together. And the reality is that President Putin made at least two big strategic mistakes when he invaded Ukraine last year. The first and most important was, of course, that he totally underestimated the Ukrainians, the strength, the commitment, the courage of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian political leadership, and the Ukrainian armed forces. The other big strategic mistake he made was to underestimate us. Our willingness, our commitment to support Ukraine, to stand by Ukraine with economic sanctions, with political support, but not least with the military support. And that's unprecedented, what we have seen now, of military support from NATO allies, from EU members, from EU, from NATO. And this is a support which is much bigger than anyone expected when this war started, with advanced artillery, with long-range cruise missiles, with advanced air defense systems, with a lot of ammunition and not least training from EU, from NATO allies. And now also I would like to commend the Netherlands, Denmark, and also Norway for announcing that they are ready to deliver F-16s, and many allies have also announced that they are ready to start training of Ukrainian pilots and technicians to enable them to have F-16s. So again, there is much more we need to do, and we need to support and sustain this support. But if we just stop for a moment and think where we are today, compared to where we thought we were going to be just weeks ahead of the invasion, I think we need to recognize the strength, the commitment, not least enabled by the European Parliament for EU members, for NATO allies, for our institutions to stand by Ukraine. And that's extremely important to recognize, because this is something that needs to continue. Our support has helped to enable the Ukrainians to launch the counteroffensive. The Ukrainians are gradually gaining ground, and it proves the importance of our support and also our ability and willingness to continue the support, because this is heavy fighting, difficult fighting, but they have been able to breach the defensive lines of the Russian forces, and they are moving forward. And that was also the clear commitment and clear message from the NATO summit in July, that we need to continue to support Ukraine. That has been the message from the European Union again and again. And the offensive just highlights the importance of standing by them. At the NATO summit, the main message was, of course, support Ukraine. We were also able to make progress on Ukraine's path towards NATO membership. We recognize what the European Union has done in granting them candidate status. In NATO, at the Vilnius summit, we made important decisions to help to move Ukraine closer to membership. We reiterated that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, but then we added 3 elements which actually move them closer to membership. First, we agreed a substantial package and also funding for a substantial package to ensure full interoperability between the Ukrainian armed forces and NATO. And interoperability between our armed forces is really a way to, in practical terms, move NATO closer, move Ukraine closer to NATO membership. The second thing we did was to strengthen the political institutionalized cooperation. We established something called the NATO-Ukraine Council, where we don't meet Ukraine as a partner, we meet as equals around the table 31 allies, soon 32, and then with Ukraine around the table as an equal. This council can make decisions. It can convene on a short notice. It can address crisis, as we did just after the summit with when the grain deal was suspended. And the plan is now to really develop the NATO-Ukraine Commission to a practical, to an important tool to strengthen the bonds between NATO and Ukraine. And the third thing we did at the NATO summit was to remove the requirement for membership action plan for Ukraine to become a member. Because previously the idea was to grant the country a membership action plan, and that was a step towards invitation. At the Vilnius summit, we said that there is no need for a membership action plan because Ukraine has already moved closer to NATO. So we turn now the membership process from a two-step process to a one-step process. And these three things, the interoperability, the NATO-Ukraine Council, and the removal of the requirement for a membership action plan for Ukraine, demonstrates that Ukraine has never been closer to a membership in NATO than now. And let me just end by saying that this reflects the political reality that nations are sovereign, nations decide themselves, and Ukraine has, of course, the right to decide its own path, and it's up to Ukraine and NATO allies to decide when Ukraine becomes a member. Russia cannot veto membership for any sovereign independent state in Europe. The other main issue at the NATO summit was to strengthen our deterrence and defense. Because fundamentally NATO has two tasks when it comes to the war in Ukraine. One is to support Ukraine, as NATO allies and NATO do. The second is to prevent escalation. And therefore, we have already increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance to send a very clear message to Moscow to remove any room for misunderstanding, miscalculation, that NATO is there to defend every inch of NATO territory, one for all for one. At the NATO summit, we agreed new plans for the defense of the whole alliance. We also agreed to establish and to identify more high readiness troops, 300,000 troops on different levels of high readiness, and also have more air and naval capabilities ready to quickly reinforce if needed. The purpose of this is to prevent war. The purpose of this is to ensure that NATO continues to be the most successful alliance in history because we have prevented any military attack on any NATO allies. And when there is a full-fledged war going on in Europe, then it becomes even more important that we have credible deterrence. And by strengthening our deterrence and defense, we are preventing war, preserving peace for NATO allies, because there is no room for miscalculation. And the third thing was that NATO allies have really now demonstrated that they are delivering on the commitment we made in 2014, because the war didn't start in February last year, it started in 2014. The full-fledged invasion happened last year, but the war, the illegal annexation of Crimea, Russia went into East Donbass in 2014. Since then, NATO has implemented the biggest adaptation of this alliance in modern history, in decades. And part of that is to invest more in defense. I think I've told you before that I know it's hard to allocate money for defense, because most politicians want to spend money on health, on education, on infrastructure instead of defense. But sometimes you have to invest in defense, and when tensions are going up, risks are increasing, they will have to invest more. And this year we expect NATO allies to increase defense spending by more than 8% in real terms. This is the biggest increase in decades, and it shows that allies are now, and of course most of them are also EU members, are now taking this very seriously. More money for defense also enables us to invest more in production of ammunition, which is extremely critical. I welcome the efforts, I welcome the decisions by the European Union, which goes hand in hand what we do in NATO. In NATO we have different arrangements for joint procurement of ammunition. We have done that for many years. We have something called the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. I welcome efforts by EU members, NATO allies, to jointly ramp up production, and we work closely with the defence industry throughout the alliance in EU, but also in non-EU allied countries, to produce more, and more spending is a precondition for also increased production. Then lastly, on Sweden, first of all, it is historic that now Finland is a member of the alliance. And we have to remember the background. The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of E and B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. He has got more NATO presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and he has also seen that Finland has already joined the alliance, and Sweden will soon be a full member. Because at the Vilnius summit, we agreed a statement where it was clearly expressed how Sweden will do more, follow up the agreement we had in Madrid on fighting terrorism, and also address issues related to export of military equipment. And then Turkey made it clear that they will ratify as soon as possible. This has been reiterated by President Erdogan several times. So I expect that when the Turkish parliament reconvenes later this autumn, the ratification will happen as soon as possible, which has been stated again and again. And then we will be 32 allies, and both Sweden and Finland will be members. This is good for the Nordic countries, it's good for Finland and Sweden, and it's also good for NATO, and it demonstrates that when President Putin invaded a European country to prevent more NATO, he's getting the exact opposite. I think I used my 10 minutes or even more so I think I stop there.
Secretary General, most welcome to the European Parliament. Once again, it's always a pleasure to have an open and frank exchange with you. Indeed, we're facing absolutely new security situation whatsoever. And with the Russian missiles, at least parts of them falling on the NATO territory, it's something what we have to reflect appropriately. I mean, this is nothing about theory. It's a very gloomy practice we have to reflect by our decisions. My first question, Secretary General, is about the lessons from the Russian aggression against Ukraine, or lessons from the Ukrainian front. What the member states of NATO and those interlinked with EU must learn. So we see absolutely different level of using drones. I would say the war went dronized, and it's not a limit, I mean, which is reached. Are we learning? Are we taking into consideration absolutely different situation in the skies? I mean, at least small flying objects which change, as well as mining. The density of mining mines used, I mean, different mines used in a war, it's something which hasn't been predicted by many experts. So that's why the Ukrainians are completely right once they say that they fight something like in between of World War I and World War III. So we have to probably understand this. And my second point, Secretary General, is about the hybrid threats which come from so-called private military formations. They are not private, I mean, they are mostly state-supported, but sometimes, I mean, from my point of view, we simply deny, I mean, and do not take into full consideration the existence. What can be done and what kind of the actions we might predict. Thank you.
points in the final communique of the Vilnius summit that you briefly also mentioned in your introduction. First, the defense spending pledge, which was originally made in 2014. We've seen significant progress with regard to increasing defense spending, but there's still a very long way to go. So how do you see the current state of implementation, and what are your expectations of getting where we want to get? And the same question about the new sort of high availability of the new pool of high readiness forces. I mean, NRF has been there for quite some time now. We have a different structure that we have set up by Madrid summit communique and Vilnius summit communique. How do you see the progress in the implementation? What do you expect to happen by the end of this year and beyond when it comes to getting to these 300,000 pool of high readiness forces?
Thank you. For ECR, Witold Waszczykowski, sorry.
And then he says, first of all, congratulations for the extension of your mandate. We are happy and appreciative of your service and performance as NATO chief. I would like to express a couple of critical remarks about the summit, but please don't take it personal. This was a good summit, but not as good as the Warsaw Summit for the Eastern Front. And the Eastern Front security is not enhanced by additional presence of NATO troops. We were expecting that NATO battalion groups would turn into brigades, or even higher, but nothing happened. Secondly, we got more detail elaborating contingent plans, but who is going to manage this plan? Who is going to command defense of the Eastern Front? There is no original NATO command to defend Eastern Front, so what is the benefit of the Eastern Front, which is 250 kilometers from the Russian border and more than 500 kilometers away from the force located somewhere in the western part of Europe to defend the eastern flank?
Thanks very much, Natalie. Mr. Stoltenberg, NATO has been vocal in identifying China as a threat. The Vilnius Summit Declaration states that China is trying to subvert the so-called rules-based international order and criticises China for being opaque about its strategy and intentions. Now, my first question is, how is it possible to subvert an order that has no constitution, no basis whatsoever in international law? And if you think it does, in fact, appeal to or have a standing in international law, why then do NATO and NATO members repeatedly violate international law without any consequence? Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, for example. China has not illegally invaded and bombed a sovereign country in over 40 years, while the US and our allies have hardly stopped in the same period, killing millions of civilians, displacing millions more, and illegally sanctioning dozens of countries to the point where tens of thousands of men, women and children are extrajudicially executed each year for simply existing in a country targeted by Western imperialism. Is it not time to return to multilateral international forums based on diplomacy and international law, like China has repeatedly urged the US to do? In July, NATO called on China to play a constructive role as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and to abstain from supporting the war effort in any way. The reality is that their positioning has allowed them to play a constructive role as a potential mediator for peace. It was NATO, the EU and the US who dismissed their peace plan. You yourself ridiculed the plan, saying that China didn't have much credibility. Credibility is about consistency and being believable. China has stayed neutral in the war, did not impose sanctions, still trades with Russia and Ukraine, and has flatly stated that they will not supply weapons to either side in the conflict. The EU has armed one side in the conflict, imposed massive sanctions, but continues to be one of Russia's biggest trade partners. Tell me, Mr. Stoltenberg, who has the most credibility?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I wanted to tell you, of course, you only had 10 minutes for your presentation, and let me tell you that I fully share your priorities that were shown during these 10 minutes, but there is one thing, sorry to say, I'm a little bit obsessed, and some of our colleagues here also, which is our southern flank. I might want to hear from you, maybe in the answers, a little bit more about the strategy. There are very warning signs coming with 8 coups d'etats in 3 years in Africa. We have been kicked out of many countries, let's put it in a diplomatic way. So what's your point of view, the top priority, we should be addressing in this question? Second, I come from Spain. As you very well know, Secretary General pays only 1.26 of our budget to NATO. Do you think this is a good figure? Could we improve it? Should we improve it? I think that's also important to know from your perspective. And third, we have received during these weeks information that Cuban army is now present in Russia, ready to take action against Ukraine. Do you have any intelligence or information about it? The Cuban army is not to be, is not very effective, but in Cuban intelligence it is. So it is, for us, a matter of worrisome that they are present. We would like to know if you have any kind of thought or information about it. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, I will ask you the questions that may be a bit forgotten. There's a book called My War Has Gone By, I Miss Him So, by one famous journalist who was a war reporter in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What shall we do about Bosnia and Herzegovina? You said that you are jumping over this membership requirement, and so for so many years NATO was asking so many questions and posing, and we have so many crisis situations there. And recently Bakir Izetbegovic called all the Muslim world to unite and help against the US and Western allies in this electoral period. So is there any chance that we are having attention there and doing some preventive diplomacy before this area becomes again hotspot? Thank you.
In advance for your answer. My question is specifically about the Black Sea and the Black Sea countries. The Black Sea is about to become a conflict zone in which Bulgaria and Romania, two NATO countries, can be directly involved in the war. How would you comment on such situation, on such development? Also, do you expect a revision of the Montreal Treaty? And how do you intend to implement a possible increased NATO naval presence in the Black Sea if the war will escalate? So, in brief, what is your strategy for the Black Sea? Can we expect a full-scale war in the Black Sea region? Thank you in advance.
It was very interesting, your exposition. I have two short questions. One of them is about Turkey. We have in Turkey a NATO member who has a very special role in this crisis. And some of us wonder where it is in every moment with this special connection which it has indeed with Moscow and the special operations they handle between Erdogan and Putin, which are more or less outside the common front of the NATO policy. And the other one is the connection, which was referred by my colleague López Istúriz, with Cuba. We know now, we confirmed that we have soldiers on the front in Ukraine, on the spot, Cuban soldiers. We wonder how long it will take that we have other people of the Foro de Sao Paulo, like Venezuelans or Nicaraguans, in this part of the world, as we have Russians in their countries. So isn't it necessary that the NATO takes really an overall look on what we are doing with some Latin American countries, as Cuba, which we are supporting after knowing this kind of actions? Thank you very much.
President, Mr. Stoltenberg, you asked us to look at where we are today compared to when the invasion started. I'm not really sure what you meant by we. I know you spent a lot of time on NATO, maybe that's the we, about the expansion with Sweden and Finland, but you were considerably quieter about the bitter disappointment experienced by Ukraine in Vilnius, that the hopes that they thought of a path into NATO didn't actually work out according to plan. Our chair said that aid somewhat compensated, which others have kind of said is that Zelensky's silence was basically purchased But in essence, really, haven't you let Ukraine down in terms of the pathway to membership? And on the subject of Ukraine, is it not the case that your rhetoric and reality are going in opposite directions and the world is beginning to notice? Because you said that Ukraine is gradually gaining ground. That's not true. Since you were here the last time, Ukraine has lost territory. 500,000 men are dead. Ukraine has had to resort to conscription. There's reports of signing people up with disability, with mental illness, men paying money to get out of the country, hiding in their houses. We're now in a bloody war of attrition, and it's simply cruel for it to go on. Now, senior US military personnel are even getting into the pages of the Washington Post and so on, echoing the call made by General Milley last November that there should be peace and a real peace. If you care about Ukraine, what's your attitude for a peace plan to save Ukrainian lives?
Last question. We have news of massive movements of troops, military equipment and munitions from Azerbaijan towards the border with Armenia that are very worrisome. There is a real risk of a new criminal war of aggression by an authoritarian regime against the democracy, not only in the disputed region of Karabakh, but also in the Zangezur and southern Armenia. Azerbaijan received weapon systems from several NATO countries. What is your position, NATO position, on this risk of escalation? Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your presentation. I've got a couple of questions. The first relates to bombing, and we've had huge numbers of people killed in Ukraine by cluster munitions, and we've now heard that Ukraine is also using cluster munitions sent by the US. 95% of all people who are killed or injured are civilians. The European Parliament in May 2009 spoke about the Oslo Convention banning cluster munition. We welcomed it, and all member states supported this. So firstly, I'd like to say that we spoke out in favor of this cluster munition ban. So what is the plan here? And what is the plan if Ukraine cannot achieve its goals? We have seen this war last years already, where millions of people have lost their lives. More and more of Ukraine has been destroyed, and it looks that we're going to end up in a very, very long war, a war that could involve all of Europe. And what should we be doing about that? Thank you.
I'll speak Spanish. I want Ukraine to get all its territory back, including Crimea. I want Ukraine to be part of the European Union and NATO, but the reality is somewhat different from what I would like to see. The reality is, if Ukraine is part of NATO, we'd have to declare war against Russia, because a NATO country would have been invaded. So until the war is ended, Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO. Since 1943, we've seen that even the best troops of the SS, the Panther, were unable to defend 40 kilometers of defenses from Kursk. So even without air superiority, it was clear that Ukraine would not be able to advance in its much touted war. And going to Tomak and Mariupol, they have to go through certain defenses. They've only been able to make a small dent on Russian forces. So this is a frozen conflict. So what will be NATO's policy with this frozen conflict, which is the reality of what we will see in Ukraine? And we cannot accept this, of course. I'm going to speak Spanish, Mr. Secretary General. Firstly, thank you for your presence here and your presentation. A great deal has been said about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I just want to change focus and talk about the Sahel. In 22 and paragraph 22 of your communique in Vilnius talked about the problems in the Sahel after what we've seen in Niger. What is the situation there? And extending to the BRICS with countries that what we've seen, you have Saudi Arabia and all of in this very strange cocktail, Iran, all these countries going to the BRICS. What do you think about this alliance?
Very specific questions on a very specific matter. A Russian drone, at least a Russian drone exploded on the territory of Romania a couple of days ago, a NATO member. First of all, the Ukrainian side has told us 3 days ago, at least 3 days ago, that this happened, but the Romanian authorities didn't find it or didn't admit it until yesterday. First question, did the Romanian authorities inform NATO that indeed there was no Russian drone explosion? Did they afterwards inform NATO that they found the Russian drone that exploded on NATO territory? And third, and very important, what is NATO doing to defend that piece of border, of NATO border, because we have a lot of citizens living there and the Russians are attacking nearly every night on that piece of Danube border near the port of Ismail, more exactly. So what is NATO doing for its citizens in order not to have those Russian drones exploding more and more on our territory? Thank you, Secretary General.
Thank you very much for being here. You have a very difficult task. And one of the difficult tasks is answering all of these questions, which I think show a range that any democracy should have, from very pro-war to those of us who question whether this war will have a conclusion in favor of the Ukraine. That's what we want. We hope it happens fast. People are dying, and as many colleagues said, it's a very sad situation. We find ourselves here, and from S&D, supporting a war and supporting more weapons, something that I didn't expect to do in my lifetime, but here I am supporting a war. Being Greek, I can't help but hope that you bring your considerable prestige and status to ensure that when Sweden joins, it should not become a bargaining tool for it to reduce its governance. Sweden has one of the highest levels in the Scandinavian countries that Greece is jealous of, governance, quality of democracy, and I hope that the bargaining tool that is being used by Turkey does not reduce Sweden's democratic principles simply because there is a strong bazaar, as they say in Greece, going on. And I know you've done much to get in that direction, and I hope you use your considerable prestige to ensure that Turkey remains the NATO member that we want it to be. Thank you.
And I would like to thank the Secretary General for his presentation and for his excellent work. Maybe he should not become a central banker, he should stay in NATO. I have a question concerning the economic performance of Russia. It seems to me that the Russian economy is more resilient than we anticipated. There is a successful shift towards India and China and Asia in general. They are producing more weapons with the help of different countries, like, for instance, Iran. They have a good understanding with Saudi Arabia and the OPEC Plus, so they keep raising, try to keep raising the price of oil. And according to what I read, their GDP is going to increase from 4 to 5% in 2023. This doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of problems, but it means, in my view, that they are in a position to keep financing this aggressive war for the years to come. Does Secretary General share this assessment with me? Thank you.
Then on the offensive and whether the Ukrainians are gaining ground or not. Well, I think we have to remember that no one ever said that this was going to be easy, the offensive. It was clearly stated that this was going to be a bloody, difficult and hard offensive. Because what we have seen is, of course, that the Russians have prepared defensive lines, layers of defensive lines, with trenches, with obstacles to battle tanks, dragon teeth, and mines, enormous amounts of mines. Hardly any time in history we have seen more mines on the battlefield than we see in Ukraine today. So it was obvious that this was going to be extremely difficult. But the Ukrainians decided to launch the offensive because they are going to liberate their land. And they are making progress. Not perhaps as much as we hoped for, but they are gaining ground gradually. Some 100 meters per day. Meaning that when the Ukrainians are gaining ground, the Russians are losing ground. And we have to remember the starting point. The starting point is that the Russian army used to be the second strongest in the world. And now the Russian army is the second strongest in Ukraine. And that's quite impressive by the Ukrainians. And that's the courage, the will, the commitment, the determination of the Ukrainian soldiers that are making this possible. And we also need to remember the starting point. And the starting point was that when the invasion happened, the full-scale invasion happened in February, we were told by most experts that Kiev would fall within days and Ukraine would fall within weeks. The Ukrainians proved them wrong by pushing back the Russian invaders, liberating the north around Kiev, the east around Kharkiv, and then bigger territories in the south and around Kherson. And now they are gaining more ground, liberating more Ukrainian territory. And then the same experts that told us that Ukraine will fall within weeks are complaining about the speed of the offensive. The reality is that the Ukrainians are actually exceeding expectation again and again. And we need to remember what's our responsibility. Our responsibility is to support them. We can advise them, but it has to be the Ukrainian commanders, the soldiers on the ground that make the difficult decisions. We cannot sit here in Brussels, in the Nato headquarters, on the EU headquarters, and tell them exactly how to fight. That's their task. They're risking their lives, and we just support them. Then I had a concrete question about the drone, the possible drone. The Romanian authorities have confirmed and informed NATO about that debris from a potential possible drone have been found near the border with Ukraine. They informed NATO allies in a regular meeting yesterday about all their findings, and the investigation is going on, and it demonstrates the risk of incidents and accidents. We don't have any information indicating any intentional attack by Russia, and we are awaiting the outcome of the ongoing investigation. Regardless of that outcome, what we have seen, of course, is a lot of fighting and also air attacks close to NATO borders. And we also had other incidents in Poland and elsewhere. And therefore, we have increased our vigilance. We are closely monitoring what's going on close to our borders. And we have also increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. There were questions about the Black Sea. The Black Sea is of great importance for NATO. We condemn that Russia has withdrawn from the Black Sea grain deal. We welcome the efforts by Turkey to try to re-establish the grain deal. Of course, the best way to ensure safe and secure shipment of grain from Ukraine is to end the war. The reason why we have these problems is because of the war. And then the grain deal is a way to try to mitigate some of the consequences of the war. Let me also say that we have increased our presence in the region. We have done that over a long period of time, but especially since the war, with more maritime patrol aircraft, with battle groups in Bulgaria, in Romania, and we are closely monitoring the whole situation in the Black Sea region, including the littoral states. There were a question about the difference between the Vilnius and the Warsaw summit, and Witold, yes, also I will not compare two very successful summits. But there is a difference, is that you're right, that in Warsaw, we decided to deploy new battle groups. What we did, actually, before Vilnius, was that we, when the morning of the invasion, we activated NATO defense plans. And by activating NATO defense plans, we give Sarkar the authority to deploy more forces where and when he deems that necessary. So he has increased the presence in the eastern part of the alliance. We have doubled the number of battle groups from 4 to 8, and we have more air and naval forces available. So we will do what is needed to defend every inch of Allied territory. This is part about forward presence, but it's also very much about our ability to reinforce, and that's the reason why a more high readiness forces is the key to address any potential threat caused by the war in Ukraine and Russia's aggressive actions. Then I need to move on. South, many questions about that. The South is, of course, of great importance for NATO. The instability in North Africa, Middle East, creates threats and challenges for the whole alliance, not only for the southern allies. We have our presence in Iraq to help them train and equip their forces to fight terrorism, ISIS. We work with countries like Mauritania, Tunisia, to help them fight terrorism. Jordan, another close partner of NATO. But I think we need to realize that this is also very much about economic and diplomatic efforts, where also other institutions than NATO has to play a key role. So again, an area where we work together, NATO and the European Union. Then China. China, we don't regard China as an adversary, but we are concerned about the challenges that China poses to our values, to our interests, and to our security. China doesn't share our values. They don't believe in freedom of speech, democratic values, and they have expressed that quite clearly. They crack down on journalists, on opposition, on dissidents across the country. We have seen how they have cracked down on democratic rights in Hong Kong. We see how they are threatening Taiwan, and we see how China is investing heavily in modern nuclear weapons, more military capabilities, and also long-range missiles, and how they also work more and more closer together with Russia. Just before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia and China signed an agreement where they promised each other a partnership without any limits, and China has not condemned the invasion of Ukraine. So I think what we need to realize is that security is not regional, security is global. What happens in Ukraine matters for Asia, and what happens in Asia matters for us. And therefore we welcome the stronger partnership we have with the Asia-Pacific countries. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea participated in the NATO summit, and we are ready to do even more, to do as much as possible to work together with these countries. Then I had several questions about defense spending. Well, of course, I would have liked to see all allies meet the 2% guideline. That is not the case. But I'm encouraged by what allies are doing. They are ramping up spending, and since 2014, all allies have increased defense spending. Back in 2014, when we made the agreement, we had only 3 allies meeting the 2% guideline. Now 11 allies meet the 2% guideline, and almost all allies have plans in place to be there within a few years. And even those allies who are not at 2% have significantly increased. Germany is one example where actually spending is going significantly up. So yes, I I see progress, and I welcome that progress. Then I think, since my time is really running out, a few more minutes. Okay, then I can say one thing about this paradox about weapons, because you said, the representative from Greece said that in a way he never believed that he would support the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. And I think for many people that's a paradox. It is a paradox. Because we all want peace. We all want to invest in something else than weapons. But the problem is that sometimes you need to invest in weapons to ensure peace. That's a basic thing. And that's a lesson we have learned again and again. And I remember very well the end of the Cold War, where we all were able to reduce defense spending. I don't know exactly the defense spending in Greece, but I know that the defense spending in my country was 3% of GDP at the end of the Cold War. Yeah. And then we reduced it to just about 1%. And I was responsible for that, at least not all of that, but part of it. Because I was a Norwegian politician, and across the lines, government, parliaments reduced defense spending because tensions went down. We saw less threats. We believed in a new partnership, and we believed in the possibility of working with Russia. And I was a strong believer in that, because we have seen again and again in history that old enemies can become friends. You see that in Europe. France, United Kingdom, Germany and France fought each other for centuries. Now they are closest friends and allies in the European Union. And if you go to the Nordic countries, we have been fighting each other since the Viking age for hundreds of years. And now Swedes and Danes and Finns and Norwegians are, the best friends. So it's possible. So I believe it was possible also to overcome, as we have done in Europe for most European countries, within the framework of the European Union and NATO, to also overcome that relationship with Russia. Russia didn't choose that path. Russia decided to control neighbors, to try to re-establish sphere of influence, and saying that there was a provocation if a country decided to join NATO. It is not a provocation, it is a democratic sovereign right of every nation to choose its own path. And therefore we had Georgia in 2008, we had Crimea in 2014, and then the full-fledged invasion in 2014. Russia's walked away, and I regret that, but then there is no other option for us than to ensure peace for NATO allies, for EU members, by investing in defense, supporting Ukraine, because if President Putin wins in Ukraine, it's a tragedy for the Ukrainians, but it's also dangerous for us. It sends a message that when they use military force, they get what they want, authoritarian leaders. So it's in our security interest to support Ukraine, and therefore I'm extremely grateful for all the support that EU members, the European Union and NATO allies are providing to Ukraine. Thank you so much.